All right. I think I am good to go. I'm still getting used to this platform. I'm not completely sure where people might be dropping in questions or anything like that. But the good and bad news is that I have so much content. I am going to probably fill most of this time. So if you do have any questions afterwards, I want to be available. Try and jump over to that kind of question and answer session afterwards. But if you can't find me there, you can definitely find me on LinkedIn. And I have open office hours every Friday at 9:30. That's completely free. So if you don't get all your questions answered now, I suspect you will have some questions because the Bitcoin white paper is pretty dense. So I'm going to get right into it. All right, so what is even a white paper? It's basically an academic thing. There's nothing fancy about this. You can go to bitcoin.org/Bitcoin PDF and read the Bitcoin white paper yourself. It's about 9 pages. It's kind of a classic thing that people use for basically to explain a complex technical thing. It's called a white paper because they can actually kind of put it into librarian, systems and whatnot, and it can be found again later, even though it's not in a journal or a book. Now, it's mostly a marketing thing. You'll be like, oh, this team has a white paper. I'm going to read it. Oh, it's so cool. The original Bitcoin white paper was actually quite revolutionary, and we're going to get into why that is. But again, it's just a 9-page PDF accessible to everybody. So what was even the whole point of this white paper was thinking, okay, now at this point in time, if you're not super old, you might not remember, there was a period of time when the internet was new and people were not comfortable using their credit card to buy things online. And there was kind of some technology that had to come into place, like guaranteeing that if this goes bad on eBay, we'll make it right with you. And then there was a turning point where everyone was okay with using credit cards online and online banking and all that sort of stuff. So that's kind of following from that inheritance forward to say, okay, now all of these things have to be done through a bank and a credit card and all that sort of stuff. I wonder if it's possible for me and you to have a cash transaction without a bank, without a credit card. And what would we have to do in order for that to work? And it turns out that if you have some special software math, it is possible to take the authority of the bank, who's acting as this third party to keep us honest. We can actually have the software itself be a third party to kind of keep everything honest. So what the whole goal of the Bitcoin white paper was to create an online peer-to-peer transfer. So we don't need a bank, we don't need an outside authority figure. But we still have to prevent a double spend or counterfeit. Like if I send you some money and I send it to somebody else, which one of you actually gets that money, right? So you can't have two, electronic coins out there. So the solution was to say, instead of having a trusted third party, what if we had a network of everybody who was going to be looking at those cryptographic signatures and transactions, and that network would actually take the place of a bank? Would that be possible? And yeah, it actually is. So if you do have the Bitcoin white paper open and you're tracking through it, there's going to be about 12 different headered sections. Okay, so it gets right into it past that intro, like why do we even need this? Next, we're going through the transactions. So it's not real obvious to people that have only heard of Bitcoin as this thing people use for payments, but it actually uses electronic signatures to create an electronic coin. And so those coins can be transferred. And the way that that happens is that there's a signing of a hash of a previous transaction, plus the public key of the destination of where it's going. And then once you get that actual coin to you, you're going to verify that all those signatures are right and there's an appropriate trail of ownership. So if you're not familiar with hashing, don't worry, we will talk about that. So a lot of times people are thinking like cryptography is so mysterious. That is just the science of keeping secrets. And so there's actually cryptography under everything you do on the internet. Basically, since the 50s, there's been electronic cryptography, encrypting files, that sort of stuff. And one of the common ways to do that is hashing. So hashing can take a normal sentence, like the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog, or whatever you want to say, a whole readable sentence. And I've got this picture of this Boggle as a toy from from the 80s. It was like a game where you could shake it up, and then you'd have these letters that would randomly have to be used in this game. Well, hashing works kind of the same. It takes all those letters and it applies some software math, and it shakes it up and creates a string that represents this one sentence or book or address or whatever that input, and puts it into a fixed length, randomly created string. And because it uses some kind of interesting cryptographic math, it makes it so many of these possibilities that it is computationally impractical to the point of being impossible to go and try and find what that original sentence was by using that hash. So you can hide things and share them. That's what's underneath cryptographic hashing. So you can just think of it as this boggle toy that shakes things up. So if you're reading the Bitcoin white paper alongside, you might be familiar with this. This is actually a very, very profound diagram. And, you know, I'm going to try and simplify it and explain it a little bit. But so we're talking about, you know, you've got a public key and a private key. Like if you've actually ever purchased Bitcoin, they'll be like, okay, this is the key that you can share, and this is the key that's private. This one is your public face. This one's your private place. Never share your private key, because if someone has your private key, they will have all your Bitcoin, right? So before we talk about how Bitcoin is ever used, you have to understand these are the signatures that create the coin. This is a block of transactions. And so in the center here, you're going to see that hash word. That's that boggle sort of step. It's taking everything that's in there in that transaction and shaking it up so it's hard to find. And then that's actually goes into its own little transaction. And what's happening is that gets pulled forward to the next transaction. Plus, the person with the private key is signing, yep, I see it happen. And so to get this pulled forward inheritance, you kind of have a mommy and a daddy. So you've got the hash of the transaction, and you've got the signature of the key, and now those can go forward. So this is an example of a block with 3 transactions in it, and you see those signatures, owner signature, that actually is the process of making a coin. So we're going to get into that. A lot of what the Bitcoin white paper talks about is like, first, here's a transaction. Now here's a block. Here's how this prevents fraud. And then the math about it, proving that this works mathematically if you want to get that deep. Today, we're not going to get into the calculations, but you'll actually see, okay, this isn't some hocus pocus where there's really just a couple of guys in a room hitting a keyboard. It is actually the computers themselves gossiping with each other to keep track of things. Okay, so one of the things that's not real obvious to get to the point where you can have online transactions is because computers can do a lot of things all at once, you have to determine, okay, which coin is the real one and which one is counterfeit. If I get a bunch of these electronic coins at the same time, how do I know this one is legitimate and not a double spend of something else? And the only way that you can verify that computationally and practically is to know about all the transactions for all time. So banking, you know, keeps transactions private because they're hiding what actual transaction happened, but you can know the person. Bitcoin kind of inverts that. You know, you have to know all of everybody's business, but I don't know who exactly did that. It's a little bit more like the stock exchange. You just see a transaction happen, and I can't automatically be like, oh, that was Bill Gates's money. Cool, cool. So it hides that by just focusing on the transactions itself. So in order to even have that, you have to say which transaction happened first. So it's not real obvious, but a timestamp is critical in order to have this peer-to-peer transfer. And then the network, all the other participants that are all keeping track of the transactions and listening for what's happening have to agree which thing happened first. And so everything has to be announced and agreed. And so there's actually kind of, you know, computer steps of how that happens. So the computer, and this little clip up here at the top is what's actually taken from the Bitcoin white paper. Again, it looks like a very simple diagram if you've never looked before. But what it does is something quite profound. So a computer is taking a block of transactions plus a timestamp, and then it's going to do that boggle and shake it all up and do that software math. Then that hash is shared and provides that timestamp. Hey guys, I've got this random number. This thing happened at this time. And then that is going to go ahead and pull forward, including the hash of the previous block. That's kind of your mommy and your daddy with that timestamp is what pulls the whole thing forward. So you have a block chained to another block. You get blockchain. So in order to even add blocks to the chain, you have to win the chance to do that. So the timestamp is added to a transaction, the hash happens, and then that hash has to be completed with a proof of work. You have to solve a puzzle, and you have to be the best winner of that puzzle in order to be allowed to add a block of transactions into the blockchain. So transaction records only work once, and that's just by design because that's going to prevent that double spend. Like, hey, if this has been spent once, that's all you get. It's basically gone after that. So if you wanted to try and, you know, fudge the system, the reason why this is profound is it requires this redo of the puzzle. And if you have to redo the puzzle after the honest work went, it is going to show that fraud or counterfeit has happened in the system because the inputs, that timestamp, all that has already changed. Time has already flowed by you like a river, and you're struggling to keep up with the honest work. So that is how you can have an immutable ledger. So humans can't go in and change it after the fact like an Excel spreadsheet. Someone can cook the books. Well, in blockchain, you know, the computation of all that hashing going forward and being pulled in means that if you try to go back in time and rewrite history, you also have to rewrite every single transaction that happened after that. And that's like so many lies. You're busy keeping up, building more and more lies. Well, the honest work is running ahead of you computationally, and it is effectively impossible for the fraud to catch up with the honest work as long as most of the people in the network are performing in honest ways. So, you know, you've got a lot of different transactions are being proposed at once. And this is where we're going to get into proof of work. How do we actually decide what gets to go and when? Right? It's like a busy train station. You need a turnstile. Everybody's trying to crowd in. Then you've got that little gating factor so one gets through at a time. You need everything in a single file line, all those transactions, so that everybody in the network knows what happened first, because everything after that is counterfeit, right? So you've got to have this throttling mechanism or a turnstile. So the thing now we get into a little bit more of that inheritance. You know, there's not a lot that's esoteric or confusing about Bitcoin because it builds on a lot of existing things. So all of us have email, all of us are familiar with a spam folder, but once upon a time, there wasn't a spam filter on email. This guy named Adam Back actually created a very interesting anti-spamming mechanism that is used under everything called Hashcash. So the point is that when a transaction is or block is trying to go through this turnstile in a single file line, it should not be free to just willy-nilly as much as you want go through. Otherwise, you're going to get like spammed with transactions. It should cost something to go through that turnstile. You're going to have a ticket of some way. So the brilliance of the Adam Back Hashcash is that it basically adds a difficulty. You have to do some work for me before I let you go through. And so that Hashcash is a bit of a puzzle, and this works all the time underneath regular email, where it's like, okay, yeah, I can totally accept an email from you, but you got to do some work first. So that's basically Bitcoin was like, hey, that was really smart. I'm going to use that too, and is referenced in the footnotes of the white papers. Like, you know, a big part of this is Adam Back's anti-spam mechanism. So in order to have this cadence of transactions and blocks that can go through, we're going to say, maybe we make it difficult or easy to push that turnstile and go through. And so there's some software behind the scenes that helps automatically set how difficult it is to push that turnstile based on how many people are trying to get through. If nobody's at the train station, it doesn't matter. You can take any turnstile you like. If it's 100,000 people trying to get through, you know, we're just going to let one person go every so often, right? And so the actual puzzle is very clever as well. You're trying to find a secret value, okay? You're just guessing a value that when it's put together with one of those hashes will lead to another output with a bunch of leading zeros. So it's like, this is your classic classic, you've got, monkeys hammering on the keyboard trying to come up with Shakespeare. So you get this banging of brute force computation that's like, okay, if I take this, then I'll go ahead and did this one? No. Okay, I'll try another one. Take this, and because it's computers, it's going a bajillion times a second, right? So the throttling is critical so you don't get an overflow, and it assigns importance to whatever active chain. It's not super obvious, but at any given time, there's a lot of people trying to add a block, and it's not proven until some other steps have been gone through. So there's kind of some iterations that, once the honest work is pulling ahead, you've got to do like 6 more of those with the puzzle and the running and the puzzle and the running until you've gotten through enough of these so exponentially it creates an almost impossible to overcome distance with that brute force computing, because you have to do this brute force computing. I'm trying to win the puzzle. And then, the honest work is like, hey, somebody won and is moving on without you. And you're like, well, if I want to try and get this thing in, I have to go and redo all this other work. And it can just never catch up as long as most of the participants in the network are honest. So this is just, what is part of the magic of Bitcoin is this by itself. That honest transactions have a mathematical computational edge, so that when we all gossip together, our computers work together and determine if something's true, there's a slight benefit for the good work and a slight disadvantage for the bad work. If the bad actors do not get a jump right away, they can never catch up. And so that's where you hear about things like 51% attack. That's because they have slightly more than half of the network. They can kind of force it. And so newer blockchains have some mitigation against that. But today we're just talking about Bitcoin. Okay, so what is this proof of work? This is the most interesting thing. When people think of Bitcoin, they think of that brute force computing. I've got to, have a mine, and I'm going to be mining, and I have to have cheap electricity. It's going to be really crazy. There's newer stuff now, but even this was very revolutionary. So we're going to have a nonce, which is basically in cryptography, this number that's more or less just used once. And we're going to say, okay, if I'm trying to pick a number that when put together with this hash will equal something with a bunch of leading zeros, I might as well just start with 1. Did that get it? No, I'll start with 2. Did that get it? Did 3 get it? Did 1,800,000 get it? And at some point you're trying to hit this output that has enough leading zeros that this was that brute force, like I have to have 32 leading zeros in this. So it's an incredible amount of computation just going crazy in there until you hit that right number. And whoever does that wins the right to add a block. So that's that throttling mechanism we're talking about. So if you're looking at proof of work, you'd be looking on the white paper at something like this. If you're trying to explain it to a friend, you can think of it as like a Sudoku puzzle that gets bigger the more people try and solve it. So this difficulty is set into the software of Bitcoin that says, hey, we only want someone to be able to solve it on average every 10 minutes. So if a lot of people are trying to solve it, we'll make the puzzle harder and bigger until no matter what, only every 10 minutes happens. And there you've got that throttling that's critical in order to prevent the system from getting flooded. So how does the network work? Okay, so we've got all these different nodes. Everybody has to be listening to the transactions. So the network pieces of, Bitcoin and distributed ledger, that's the distributed part, right? So essentially there's minimal structure to it. Messages are just broadcast on best effort. If you're not there to pick up, it's not a big deal. When you wake up, I'll tell you what I had and all your friends will tell you what they had, and you'll just accept the longest chain and get caught up. It's not a big deal. So you can absolutely leave and join. So how it works for the computers, do not feel like you have to read these. These were notes that I cribbed from the graduate class that David teaches. I put together slides for that. So essentially your computer that's running a node is going to say, hey, this is the version of the chain that I have. This is how many blocks it has. And this is what time I think it is. If the other node out there is like, hey, yeah, I'll talk to you. We're friends. That's cool. What do you know? What's good? And so you're going to say, hey, yeah, I know you too. Let's talk. Then you're going to collect some time data, be like, it's kind of a very interesting problem. It's not real obvious that there is no global time in computing because reasons. If there's not the way that we use time for like science and physics and stuff is kind of different from the way that time is used in computers. So they're kind of also doing a little bit of consensus on this. Is like, this is what I think, and whatever they kind of agree on is what they work off of. And so there's a median time that's basically used. And then the next thing is like, once we've got that handshake and we're talking, we've agreed what time it is, we'll be like, hey, who do you know? Here's everybody that I know. And we're going to gossip not just about what transactions are happening, but my entire, address book. It'd be like, oh, these are the nodes that I talk to. And that way we can not only have an idea of shunning bad transactions or bad actors attempting to win blocks, but also nodes that are trying to get a leg up to be fraudulent in the system and tell us things that aren't true. So essentially now we would start talking about the transactions I think that are happening. We're going to be requesting information. We're going to be talking to our peers. And essentially any computer that connects to the Bitcoin network is a node, right? So if you're connected at all, you're a node. But there's full nodes that literally keep the entire record from the beginning. So Bitcoin started in 2009. If you're running a full node, you have literally every transaction from ever, right? If you're just carrying one around on your phone, you're like, I've got a lightweight version. It's kind of doing an abbreviated version of just this particular moment in time and a couple other things behind the scenes. So if you're looking like, well, where does Bitcoin even live? You'd be looking for, full nodes in the Bitcoin core. Okay, so how it works, transactions are broadcast. A node, your computer, my computer, any node is gonna go ahead and collect transactions. I'm like, hey, here's some people that wanna do some stuff. I'm gonna try and put together my block. I'm gonna try and get that puzzle made for my block. I'm gonna hash it. I'm gonna try adding, the proof of work with the nonce, and I'm gonna try and if I win one, I'm like, look, guys, I have my 32 zeros. Do I win? Do I get to go? And I tell everybody about it, and all of my transactions would be included. And now everybody else is trying to be like, hey, I'm not so sure about this. I'm going to verify what you told me before I start building on it. No shade. I just got to check for my own reasons. Okay. Now, once they have accepted it, if they start building on it, they use your block as the history, the mommy and the daddy. They're like, yeah, come on down. That sounded right. I'm going to pull your, inheritance forward into my block. And you're like, oh, they really liked it. Good, good, good. Okay, so the incentives. This is mostly what people think about when they think about Bitcoin, are the actual cryptocurrency coins that people are like, oh, I'm so fancy, I have cryptocurrency. This is the one part of the Bitcoin white paper, kind of keeping an eye on, is these transactions create a lot of work. And so this is a way to go ahead and reward people for doing that computer work of solving puzzles and gossiping with each other. It said, hey, okay, if you win, if you got that block across the finish line, let me go ahead and give you some Bitcoin. You can use that later for something else. Now, this became kind of like a coupon that was essentially used as a store of value. And there's a whole separate universe of this creation of a new money market around using those. But that was not really contemplated in the original Bitcoin white paper. This was just talking about how can we have a peer-to-peer transaction. Not, how can we have crypto exchanges and altcoins and all this other stuff? This is back the original thing. So originally, it's basically like, if you're doing all these puzzles trying to win, that's like mining. If there's this throttling mechanism in the real world, you can only pull out 2% more gold out of the hills every year. That's why it's a good, store of value. Bitcoin, because it has that throttling, is a similar type of thing. It has some stability as a store of value because it's suitably rare. So people are worried about, well, what happens after all the new coins are mined and there's only going to be 21 million? Actually, the system is going to run off transaction fees after that. So don't worry about that. If the output of that transaction is less than the input, you have to make up the difference by putting a stamp on that letter. Not a big deal, not confusing. Okay, so I want you to be able to leave this session with understanding what is Bitcoin. There is some software code that lives somewhere that people actually contribute to, and there's improvement plans. Okay, there's also the nodes in the network. Every computer that is running Bitcoin is participating in that network. Now, there's the cryptographic signatures in those transactions, but what you end up with was basically one big log file. So there's no magic in it. It's just software. There's some stuff about disk space. You'll recognize this. It's basically like, hey, I don't have to know your whole family to know you're descendant from somebody. That's essentially what we're talking about, pruning out the Merkle tree. If you're super into math, you'll find this exciting and you can brag about it to your friends. If not, we can skip it. Payment verification. You do not have to run a full node to verify payments. That's why I can run Bitcoin wallets off my cell phone, right? You just have to keep a copy of the block header and some, the pruning Merkle branch, and then linking. You can see that the network has actually already accepted it. That address is good to go, and you're fine to work off that like it is already true, because all the other people have done a lot of heavy lifting behind the scenes. So again, this is that simplified verification. Like, be familiar with this, and I'll tell you a little bit what it means too. Is like when you're doing those sort of transactions, you don't have to get involved in the heavy lifting as long as there's plenty of nodes. If you're thinking about getting into a new cryptocurrency or new blockchain, the number of nodes matters. So they'll take away on that one. So combining, sometimes people don't understand how these work on the inside. It's not like one coin in, one coin out. It's basically everybody sends some in, and then I get my change back, and you get where you're supposed to get. Privacy is kept by keeping the public key anonymous. So you have a key and you're known by that key. Nobody calls up and says, hey, is this McAfee or whatever. There are some calculations in there, and this whole section is just talking about how the honest work overcomes the fraudulent work. And essentially that transaction where I had the one guy, the blue guy was outrunning the orange guy. That's basically just some math on how that actually works. So the outcome, the conclusion, is that you can have transactions without relying on a bank or some sort of other trusted source like a credit card company. You can actually prevent a double spend or counterfeit in that system. You just have to have a peer-to-peer network with some sort of proof of work, or now there's other proof methods, and honest transactions come ahead. So that puts me exactly on time. Obviously, it's a lot of content. David actually teaches a full semester-length graduate course that covers, I had to weed out about 300 slides to get down to 20 minutes for you guys. So if you do have more questions, please come find me on LinkedIn. I'm Jade Barker, the Warrior Princess of Tech. Also, we have open office hours every Friday. I do keep a link for that in my LinkedIn profile as well. And that's all I've got, I think. Thank you so much.